If you think colors are just decoration, think again. They read your soul before you do. Watch closely, because what you're about to learn will change how you see every room, every person, and even yourself. Carl Jung didn't believe in coincidences, especially not in the colors we surround ourselves with. When you see red, your body stops before you can think. I used to think red meant passion, energy, even courage. That's what we were told. In clothes, in advertising, in love. But over time, I noticed something quieter, then more physical. Red didn't inspire me. It interrupted me. It made my shoulders rise just slightly, my breath shorten, and beneath that tension, something raw stirred. Not excitement, not love, something like a warning. It was never about color alone. Jung believed red awakened one of our oldest instincts. The impulse to defend, to confront, to survive. Not through thought, but through sensation. Red doesn't ask what you think. It tells you how to feel. You don't choose red. It happens to you. One morning, at a nearly empty intersection, I stopped at a red light. There were no cars, no movement, and yet I waited. Not because of the rule, but because my body had already obeyed. That moment stayed with me. It reminded me, red doesn't just signal danger, it exerts control. It breaks our rhythm, takes us out of thought and into reflex. Jung might say that red activates the ego's frontier, the point where your will meets the unconscious force beneath it, where the warrior wakes up, or the wounded child steps forward uninvited. Red is not simply provocative, it's ancestral. It's the drumbeat before battle, the flush of humiliation, the color that floods the face not when we speak, but when we've been seen. And maybe that's why red is so uncomfortable to sit with, because it doesn't hide, it exposes. Whatever already lived inside you, anger, desire, fear, red pulls it to the surface like heat to skin. It demands awareness. So now, when I see red, on a sign, in a room, in someone's expression, I don't try to name it too fast. I pause. I breathe, and I ask myself quietly, what is this color trying to protect? Because sometimes the parts of us we silence the longest wear the loudest shade. The calmness of blue isn't always peace. Sometimes it's retreat. There was a time I thought I loved blue, the soft quiet of it, the feeling of order it gave. My room, my clothes, even the apps I chose, all some shade of blue. It made me feel clear, unbothered, in control. But then came a day by the lake. The sky above me mirrored the water below, both endlessly blue. I sat there thinking I felt peace. But when I paid closer attention, I realized I didn't feel it all. I was floating, detached, untouched, absent. Jung once wrote that blue speaks not just to the soul, but to its need to avoid what the body still carries. It's the color of withdrawal, disguised as wisdom. In my case, it wasn't serenity. It was a clever way to drift beyond discomfort, to live just far enough above life that nothing could hurt me. Blue isn't cold because it lacks feeling. It's cold because it numbs it. It gives the illusion of depth without ever making you dive. In blue, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't connect. I intellectualized my pain until it became an idea, manageable, neat, and distant. I began to notice it in others too. People who spoke calmly but never revealed anything real, whose tone stayed measured even when their eyes looked lost. The friend who always gave advice but never asked for help. The colleague who kept things professional even when their world was falling apart. Blue people, like I had been, composed, contained, and quietly alone. Jung might suggest that blue is the mask of the thinker who's afraid to feel, the person who confuses silence with control. But peace, real peace, doesn't hover above life. It holds it. So now, when I feel the pull toward blue, toward clean spaces, distant tones, abstract thoughts, I pause, not to reject it, but to ask, what part of me is trying to disappear? Because not all stillness is healing. Sometimes it's just silence with better lighting. I used to think yellow meant joy, that it was honest, a color that didn't hide. Rooms painted in yellow felt alive. People who wore it looked like they were glowing from within. For a while, I believed in that glow, until one conversation shifted everything. A friend, always cheerful, always radiant, once said quietly over coffee, I laugh because if I don't, I'll cry, and I'm scared I won't stop. I remember how still I went in that moment. Her voice didn't shake, but something inside me did. For the first time, I saw yellow not as light, but as effort. Jung believed every symbol, every color, carries both message and mask. Yellow, he said, represents energy, consciousness, even optimism, but it can also be performance. A brightness built not on joy, but on the need to survive being seen. I began to trace my own use of yellow. The polite laughter in group settings, the quick jokes to avoid tension, the way I lit up at gatherings even when I felt empty. I wasn't expressing joy. I was managing perception, painting sunshine over fog. Socially, we reward yellow. We're drawn to positive people, as if their brightness protects us too. But too often, we mistake their light for strength, when sometimes it's just exhaustion wrapped in friendliness. And the danger is, the more you're praised for being light, the more terrified you become of showing your dark. Jung might say, your persona isn't your truth, it's your strategy. And yellow, though warm, can become armor. Not to keep danger out, but to keep your real self from being judged. Now, when I see yellow, I still feel its warmth. But I also wonder, is this light a signal of joy or a signal for help? Because some smiles aren't celebrations. They're shields. There was a stretch of weeks when I couldn't tolerate crowds, noise, or even small talk. I stopped replying right away. I walked slower. I found myself in parks, bookstores, hallways with windows and plants. Not searching for balance, just space. At first, I thought I was reconnecting with nature, but when I looked closer, I wasn't reaching out. I was pulling away. Green became a texture I wrapped around me. The deep hoodie, the moss-colored mug, the olive curtains that muted morning light. These weren't aesthetic choices. They were signals, quiet boundaries I didn't know how to ask for in words. Jung suggested that symbols arise when language fails. Green, in this sense, isn't merely about growth. It's about withdrawal that looks polite. It says, I'm still here, but don't ask anything of me. I began to see how often we confuse green with healing. But there's a kind of stillness that doesn't restore you. It just protects your edges from fraying. I wasn't meditating in parks. I was hiding in plain sight. In others, I noticed the same. The colleague who always had a plant on her desk but never spoke about herself. The friend who preferred long walks over conversations. They weren't avoiding people. They were buffering themselves. Choosing a color that asked for softness without admitting hurt. Jung might say, green sits between contact and retreat. A liminal zone where the psyche catches its breath. But stay too long in that pause, and it turns from sanctuary into silence. So now, when I reach for green, in clothing, in spaces, in mood, I ask, am I seeking calm or avoiding confrontation? Because real peace doesn't mean less noise around you. It means less fear inside you when the noise returns. Black isn't always anger. Sometimes it's protection from a world that doesn't know when to stop asking. There was a time I wore black every day without thinking. Not for fashion, not for expression, just because it felt safe. It was the one color that didn't demand anything. No statement, no explanation, no emotion. It let me take up less space, without apology, without questions. We're often told black is threatening, that it signals defiance, sadness, danger. But Jung believed black points us inward, into the unconscious, the unknown. It isn't a rejection of life. It's a return to where life begins again, in silence. When I walked into rooms in black, I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to be unbothered. I wanted the right to be quiet, without anyone interpreting that quiet as a problem. In black, I wasn't erased. I was untouchable. But the longer I stayed wrapped in it, the more I noticed something shifting. I forgot what it felt like to be seen. Not judged, just seen. The mirror became foreign, the colors in my closet blurred. I didn't feel hidden. I felt unfinished. Jung might have said, when we mistake protection for identity, the symbol becomes a cell. Black had become my silence, but it also dulled my voice, so I started small. A grey shirt, a soft scarf with a hint of color. At first I expected to feel exposed, but instead I felt intact. I wasn't overwhelmed. I didn't vanish. I was still myself, just with a little more light. Now I choose black with intention, not to retreat, but to restore, to step away from noise without disappearing into the void. Black is no longer a shield, it's a boundary. A pause, a reminder that stillness isn't emptiness, it's depth. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining your silence. White isn't always purity. Sometimes it's nothing. I once stepped into a room that was completely white. Walls, floors, even the furniture. At first it felt pristine, even holy, but then something strange happened. I hesitated, as if my presence might stain it, as if breathing too loudly would break its silence. That pause revealed something deeper, and I wasn't admiring beauty. I was entering a void. We like to think white is clarity, peace, cleanliness. But Jung would suggest what we call purity often hides a fear of content. White doesn't comfort, it exposes. And in that exposure, it reveals how unprepared we are for blankness. There was a phase when I chased white. Minimalist spaces, empty calendars, quiet rooms. I told myself I was simplifying, but what I was really doing was deleting. Deleting noise, yes, but also emotion, depth, spontaneity. White gave me control, but it robbed me of contrast, and without contrast, nothing truly appears. I remember standing in front of a blank canvas once, brush in hand, heart pounding. It wasn't the art I feared, it was the beginning, the moment before the first mark, when you're fully alone with choice. That's the terror of white. It doesn't hide you, it leaves you nowhere to hide. Jung's path to individuation isn't paved with silence, but with meaning drawn from it. White is not absence, it's potential. But that potential is weighty. It demands you contribute something of yourself, not just occupy the space. So I started sitting longer in white rooms, not filling them with sound or distraction, just listening to what rose up in the quiet. And slowly, the fear shifted. I stopped feeling like a visitor. I became the voice that broke the stillness. Now, when I see white, I don't retreat. I reflect. I ask myself, what story is this blankness inviting me to tell? Because white isn't peace until you bring your own presence into it. Purple isn't seen by everyone, but those who do are already changed. I didn't choose purple. It arrived quietly, not through clothes or design, but through feeling. It began in small, wordless moments, looking out a window longer than necessary, sensing the shift between day and night, sitting with questions I no longer needed to answer. It didn't announce itself like red, or numb me like blue. It stayed still and waited. Jung spoke of integration, not just healing parts, but accepting contradictions. Purple doesn't ask you to become something. It lets you stand at the edge of who you were and who you're becoming. It holds paradox without forcing resolution. That's why it's not loud. It doesn't need to be. I started noticing it in evenings, when I wasn't trying to prove anything, not even to myself. I didn't need to explain why I left the room or stayed in silence, or didn't reply right away. I was simply present, and that presence wasn't passive. It was a kind of quiet sovereignty. Purple is made of tension, red's intensity and blue's depth, action and introspection fused. That's why it often shows up in people who've burned through ambition and come out softer, not weaker, wiser, not detached, aware. Jung might say, purple is the archetype of the inner guide, the part of you that doesn't command, but invites, that doesn't need recognition, because it already knows. I no longer look for purple in objects. I feel it in people, in the way someone listens without judgment or asks a question that doesn't need an answer, in the gaze that holds space instead of filling it, in my own decision to pause instead of rush, to witness instead of control. And now, when purple appears, not just in the sky, but in the tone of a voice, in the space between words, I know something has changed, because purple doesn't enter loud lives. It enters quiet thresholds. You don't choose a color. A color tells you who you are. For a long time, I thought I liked certain colors for aesthetic reasons, taste, style, mood. But now, when I look back at the shades I wore during grief, the ones I avoided in love, the ones I surrounded myself with during change, I no longer see preferences. I see messages. There was a time I craved white, not for peace, but for escape. I needed silence so badly, I chased blankness. But silence without meaning doesn't soothe. It erases. Then came black. Not mourning, but armor. I didn't want to be strong. I wanted to disappear without having to explain why. Green followed. I called it healing, but it was more like catching my breath. I wasn't ready for the world, so I chose something still. It wasn't peace. It was pause. Yellow appeared on the days I felt least bright. I wore it as proof I was okay. It worked until it didn't, because pretending to shine only deepens the ache. And then, purple. Not in moments of victory, so not in noise, but in a kind of return. I didn't find clarity. I found enough quiet to notice what was already true. Jung taught that symbols bypass the intellect. They speak directly to the soul, and color, more than any word, reveals who we are before we explain it. Not who we show, but who we've been becoming. So now, when I notice the color I'm drawn to, not just on walls or clothes, but in people, in places, in moments, I don't ask, does this suit me? I ask, what is this color reflecting about where I am right now? And in that reflection, I often find something I wasn't ready to say, but needed to hear. Because when you see red and freeze, or reach for green to breathe, or avoid yellow when you're low, you're not just reacting. You're remembering. You don't see color, you feel it. And sometimes that feeling tells the truth before you do.